I'm Alistair Bunkall, Sky's Middle East correspondent. It's been a busy day here in Jerusalem as events unfolded in the middle of the night and renewed Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, which have continued throughout the day. And so thank you for everybody who has sent in questions for me to try and tackle. So we've got probably, 20 minutes or so to go through as many as we can. So let's start with Harry, who asks, quite a straightforward question, but a good one to kick us off with. Who broke the ceasefire agreement, Israel or Hamas? Well, I mean, simply Israel broke it because Israel resumed airstrikes in Gaza, and that is a breach of the ceasefire. We have seen some limited attacks over recent weeks whilst the ceasefire has been in force, but nothing on this scale. So I think it is fair to say that Israel has broken the ceasefire, but Israel's justification for it is twofold. One, that it has seen Hamas regrouping and rearming, so it has taken this action to disrupt that. And secondly, negotiations to try and extend the ceasefire, in Israel's opinion at least, were not heading in the right direction. And so this is a way to try and pressure Hamas into accepting the deal that Israel wants. I'm sure we'll probably talk a little bit more about the detail of that in due course. Baker asks, was it inevitable that the war was going to break out again? I think simply yes, it probably was. People here in Israel and in Gaza probably thought it would break out. I think actually everybody, myself included, was rather surprised that the ceasefire held for as long as it did, particularly given that for the last couple of weeks we've been in a kind of an interim limbo period, really. Phase one came to an official end a few weeks ago. There had been no agreement to move into phase two. And so the two sides kept the ceasefire going really kind of sort of as an unwritten thing as negotiations continued in Qatar and in Cairo. But I think a lot of people expected this moment to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, always said all along that he would not commit to an official or final end of the war, and always wanted to retain the right for Israel to resume the fighting. And that is where we are now. An anonymous person writes and says, is there any way of verifying the figures from the Hamas health ministry? So the figures coming out today are more than 400 killed, and I think more than 500 wounded. But this is a question that a lot of us have grappled with throughout this war and in previous rounds of conflicts between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Islamic Jihad, which is another smaller militant group inside Gaza. How reliable are the fatality or the casualty figures? How much can we trust them? We cannot trust them verbatim. We have to caveat our reporting of those figures that they come from the health ministry in Gaza, but we ourselves as international journalists can't get access to Gaza. Israel won't allow us in unless it's on an IDF embed. So there's no way of us getting on the ground ourselves and seeing all events with our own eyes, getting to the hospitals, getting to the morgues in the aftermath of airstrikes and seeing it and reporting it for ourselves. So that proves one challenge. Secondly, although the figures are cited by the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, we also hear, either privately or on Sky News and other news organizations, from doctors operating in Gaza. And many of those doctors are not Palestinians. They are international doctors who've gone in to help run and staff some of the hospitals or the field hospitals in Gaza. And again, to some extent, we have to listen to and take the word of what medical professionals are saying. And we have to separate doctors, medical professionals from Hamas militants. And so, it is always hard, and we can't be 100% sure of what the fatality figures are, not least because the aftermath of major airstrikes is a very chaotic situation. But we do the best we can do to make people understand where that figure is coming from, and any caveats around that, but also to get testimony from those inside Gaza who we can do. UK Flyer asks, what is Trump's stance on the new strikes? Well, the US government has supported Israel in these new strikes. They released a statement overnight after the Israeli airstrikes began, saying that it was Hamas who had effectively chosen war over a continuation of the ceasefire and the release of more hostages. So for the time being, at least, Israel has the backing of the White House. And that is important. The White House, President Trump, is crucial. His support is crucial to Israel carrying this through. We've seen the effect that President Trump can have on the situation here. When he came into office, he and his team, including the Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, were quite quickly able to push through the ceasefire that's been in force for almost 2 months now, and put pressure on all sides. And we've seen Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, in the region on multiple occasions, trying to make sure that ceasefire can be extended. But ultimately, Witkoff came up with a plan to try and have what they describe as a bridging proposal, and that's to extend the ceasefire for a number of weeks, probably 6 weeks, to get more of the hostages out. Israel was on board with that plan. Hamas was not on board with that plan. Hamas wanted to stick to the original agreement that was signed back in January that would have seen the ceasefire move from phase 1 into phase 2. And phase 2 would have meant the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, an official end to the war, and the end of Hamas rule in Gaza, something that nobody has yet been able to work out how that would happen. The removal of Hamas leaders, for example, from Gaza, the handover of rule in Gaza to another body. Nobody was able to agree on that. So at the moment, and I don't think we've actually heard from President Trump himself, he's obviously somewhat more engaged today in this upcoming phone conversation he's got with Russian President Vladimir Putin regarding the situation in Ukraine. So I don't think we've actually heard from the US president, but at the moment, Israel has the support of the White House. How long for, though, I think is a valid question to ask. Izzy asks, what happens now? What's a realistic long-term solution to the conflict? What happens now? Well, Israel has said that it has plans in place to expand the conflict, expand its operations if it needs to do so. In this 2 months of ceasefire, Israeli military commanders have been drawing up plans for a renewal of the conflict, and that could include a major ground operation. If it does, I think it'll be different to what we saw first time around, mainly because this time Israel doesn't need to worry about Hezbollah and the threat from Hezbollah on Israel's northern border because of the war it fought with Hezbollah and what has happened in Lebanon subsequently. And so it could focus far more of its ground forces onto Gaza, and therefore hit Gaza from multiple angles all at once. So a full-scale ground invasion. And there are, I should say, Israeli forces still in Gaza. They've never left Gaza. They've been in sort of holding positions, agreed positions within Gaza. But a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza could happen on a very large scale indeed. And you ask, what's a realistic long-term solution to the conflict? I mean, that's a question that could take the next 20 minutes or so. Ultimately, what has to happen, and probably what will happen, whether it's in the short term or whether it takes some time to get there, is that negotiations will resume. and the negotiations will lead to another ceasefire agreement. And people in Israel hope that that means the release of all the remaining 59 hostages in Gaza still, of which 24 are believed to be alive and the remaining dead. And the Israeli government, and others, the Americans and many Middle East countries, actually, I have to say, that I speak to, also think that Hamas needs to be removed from power and Gaza needs to be disarmed. So that is the kind of the ultimate goal, if you like. And then they can get to who's going to rebuild it, who's going to finance it, who's going to govern it. But whether or not we get back to a position of negotiations in the coming hours, we will have to see. But certainly these airstrikes on Gaza are partly intended to push Hamas back to the negotiating table, but not just to the negotiating table, but into a position, into a concession that is acceptable to Washington and to the Israeli government. Tom asks, should sanctions now be brought against Israel, or are we just going to stand back and watch more women and children be killed in the days ahead? Very few sanctions have been brought against Israel. The UK has limited, as have some other countries, limited arms sales to Israel. It's had very little effect because actually the UK and others really don't provide that many weapons to Israel. The United States, as it all comes back to the United States is the big supplier of military aid to Israel. So unless the United States were to limit supplies, which they've kind of done on one occasion before, but they've shown absolutely no indication, and I can't see that happening, then really anything that the UK, France, Germany does will be rather limited in its effect. As for economic sanctions, again, I can't see that happening. The Labour government in the UK has inherently a far more pro-Palestinian approach to this situation, but still the economic security cooperation between the UK and Israel is still pretty strong. So I can't see sanctions being introduced anytime soon by any country that could have a profound effect on Israel's position whatsoever. And it's kind of notable that the British government has been quite quiet on this matter as well. Bob asks, would British aid workers be able to leave Gaza or rotate like before? How will the hospitals cope without resupplies at the rate of new patients? Israel has closed the Rafah crossing today, which is the crossing between Gaza and Egypt. Now, that crossing in recent weeks had been staffed by a mission from the European Union. They would bust in every day, I think, from Egypt to sort of man that crossing and to allow Palestinians out if they were approved to leave by Israel. So that crossing is now closed. I think it's too early to know how any aid workers who are currently in Gaza will get out. Often in the first days of conflict in Gaza, everything remains completely shut. And so I suspect for the moment, anybody who's there will have to remain there. How will hospitals cope without resupplies? Well, I mean, the hospitals are pretty much destroyed from the 15.5 months of fighting already. Certainly, the last 2 months of the ceasefire have helped get a lot of supplies in, not just food, water, but for the hospitals, medical supplies, generators, fuel, supplies to sort of start rebuilding some of those hospitals, to at least to a point where they can sort of function. But everything we've been hearing from doctors we've been speaking to in Gaza today is that they've been overwhelmed by the numbers of dead and injured that they've had to treat because of the airstrikes. Israel, I should remind you, blocked humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza a week or so ago, and then shut off electricity supply that it supplies to a desalination or water desalination plant in Gaza. And all of that will make things, assuming that blockade remains, things will get progressively worse, because there's probably, well, I mean, Israel estimates there's enough aid in Gaza now to last 5 months. I think that is very optimistic. But even if that were the case, that aid will start to run out. Fuel that is used to power generators that the hospitals use for electricity, that will start to run out. It will just start to gradually make life even harder than it is now. Lawrence says, surely the only way to resolve this is for Hamas to surrender and release the hostages immediately. That's what the UN should be saying. So yeah, this is a position taken by a lot of people, by the Israeli government. I think, stepping back from it, and whatever your position or your opinion on Hamas, this ultimately is a war, and wars have two sides, and wars typically in the modern era end in a negotiated settlement. Like it or not, Hamas has a say in that, and Hamas has 59 hostages, and those hostages for Hamas are, incredibly valuable bargaining chips. And now I know we are talking about Hamas using many Israeli civilians and their lives to bargain with, and as I say, you might find that incredibly unpalatable, but it is nonetheless the situation, like it or not. And so it might be, you can say the only way is for Hamas to surrender and release the hostages, but you have to also ask yourself the question, why would they do that? They'd be signing their own death warrant. And so realistically, if you accept that that's not going to happen, then you have to think, well, how do you end the war? Hamas. And we have seen that negotiated settlements, as we saw with the ceasefire, do work. Well, at least we've seen many of the hostages returned. Hamas do remain in power in Gaza. They control much of Gaza still. They are not the military force they were, but they do control much of Gaza still. But until the Israeli government, the American government, Arab states, whoever it might be, or collectively come up with an alternative for that and create the conditions for an alternative power in Gaza, then if you've got nothing to replace Hamas with, then Hamas will continue to rule the streets of Gaza and use their power and influence, whether through fear or favor, to have influence in Gaza. And so that side of the process could take a very, very long time, but it needs all sides to engage on it. You need to put an alternative government or administration in Gaza that is acceptable to the Israelis, that is acceptable to the Palestinians, that is acceptable to the Americans, that is acceptable to bordering countries like Egypt, for example. And trying to get agreement on that is proving very, very hard. So, of course, if Hamas was to surrender, hand over all the hostages, then sure, the fighting would stop. I'm just making the point, though, how realistic is it that Hamas is going to do that? And if you agree that it's unrealistic, then you have to ask, what are the other steps that can be taken in order to achieve those outcomes, albeit through a more protracted way? And maybe you think that, resuming the fighting is the right way to do it. I mean, certainly that is the view of the Israeli government, and many in Israel share that view. Stevie in Glasgow, don't you think the way the hostages have been paraded on release has added to Israel's anger and made it easier for them to return to military action? Yeah, I mean, it's angered the Israeli government and many in Israel. These events being used, these moments being used as propaganda events, particularly distastefully when a couple of the hostages were taken to watch the release of other hostages and then taken back into captivity. That was seen as an act of gross cruelty. There's been moments when the hostages have had to be sort of maneuvered through crowds of Palestinians around them. They've been put up on stage and been made to speak to crowds of Palestinians with armed militants by their side. Hamas has used it for its own propaganda, but it has angered Israel for very understandable reasons. I don't think that is the reason for the return to military action, to be honest. I think there are other reasons behind that. How are we doing for time? Okay, it's 20 past. Let's answer one or two more questions, and then I think the time is up. Airstrikes asks, is this the land clearance for the new Trump resort? So this is reference to Trump saying he wants to own Gaza, clear it out, build a sort of Middle East Riviera. I think, the sense I get from Washington is that the Americans have gone quite quiet on that. I always sort of felt that when Trump made that announcement, as kind of bold and shocking as it was, I think a lot of the purpose behind it was to jolt Middle Eastern countries into action, into coming up with their own plan, which is what has happened, actually. The Egyptians have brought together a plan that has got pan-Middle Eastern agreement on. They're then looking to present that plan to Washington to try and get Washington's approval, and that would involve rebuilding Gaza, but moving people within Gaza to certain areas whilst they rebuild some of the urban areas. And then once those urban areas are rebuilt, people can move back. And it would take years and years and years, but it is a plan that would not require Palestinians in Gaza to leave unless they wanted to do voluntarily, which is another matter. So my sense is that for all that Donald Trump was saying a number of weeks ago, and he put that extraordinary sort of AI video of him lying on the beach with Netanyahu in this kind of fantasy Gaza land that was pretty distasteful. For all that, I don't think it is a policy that Trump is going to pursue. I think that he realizes that it's a non-starter for multiple reasons, and probably something closer to what the Arab plan is ultimately what's going to happen. Thing is, that is now going to be pushed back because we're now in a situation where the fighting has resumed in Gaza. I said the fighting has resumed. At the moment, I'm pretty sure Hamas has not fired any rockets into Israel in retaliation, and I'm not aware of Hamas engaging Israeli forces in Gaza either in retaliation. So at the moment, the resumption of hostilities is all coming from the Israeli side. We will see whether that continues or not. Right, I think that's it. It's almost 25 past. We've got a report to put together for tonight, bringing in some of the picture in Gaza. We've been up to the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, about an hour or so ago, a couple of hours ago, where there's a bit of an anti-government protest going on there. Quite small, I should say, barely more than 100 people, but they are very concerned that resumption in the fighting will put the lives of hostages at risk. So there is a lot of opposition to this in Israel as well. I mean, I should make that clear. A lot of people in Israel think that this is a cynical ploy by Netanyahu. It doesn't need to happen, and that they should all get back around the negotiating table. That is one view, at least in Israel. Anyway, all of that will go into our report for later tonight. Thank you for sending in these questions. There'll be much more on the Sky News website. There's the live blog up at the moment. I think it was still the top story. If you go onto the Sky News app or the Sky News website, updating with all the latest from here. And I guess we'll see what happens tonight. Whether or not this was a sort of a one-off military operation to try and force Hamas's hand, or whether Israel will follow through and continue its airstrikes overnight and possibly increase its military activity. So we'll be watching that very closely in the coming hours. But thank you again for watching this. I hope I managed to get through as many questions as possible and answer them reasonably clearly and understandably. And I'm sure we'll do this again soon. But as I say, Sky News app, Sky News website for the latest, Sky News TV, you can see it on behind for the latest as well. And speak to you soon.